The number of people living in the private rental sector has increased by over 100% in the last decade. Competition for accommodation, particularly in cities, is huge. And as with any sector, when demand goes up, so too do the prices. But when it comes to housing, should the rules be different? Should we have rent controls? We're going to be talking about that in just a moment. But first, Tadhg Enright has been looking into how renting in Dublin compares to our European neighbours.
1 in 5 Irish households now lives in private rented accommodation. Back in 2006, it was just 1 in 10. And the reason for queues like this is that there aren't enough properties for people who want to rent them.
A lot of demand. I called someone, it's like, yeah, come at 10:30, and then there was a queue of 10 people or so.
You arrive and just 30 other people there.
It's impossible to find a place. And when you find it, it's so expensive.
Very expensive.
Very expensive?
Like a ridiculous price. A lot of the time, the stuff you end up in is not worth paying for.
If landlords have kind of got a monopoly in places as well, they kind of maybe can charge whatever they like.
We got a sneak peek at Private Residential Tenancies Board figures, which reveal that average rents in Ireland rose by 5.8% last year. In Dublin, the increase was more dramatic at 9.6%.
Right now, it's definitely a landlord's market, and many tenants feel hard done by. But should they? How do our rights here in Ireland compare with elsewhere in Europe?
Hi, I'm David.
And I'm Anna-Marie.
And we've both been living here in Copenhagen, Denmark for around 3 years.
Hi, I'm Kate. I live in Berlin in a one-bedroom flat.
Hi, I'm Roshinana. I live in Paris in a one-bedroom, 26-metre square apartment.
This is a typical rental apartment in Dublin. 2 bedrooms, 80 square metres and fully furnished. Irish landlords can charge whatever rent you agree to pay. And right now, an apartment like this could command €1,300 a month.
The average rents for a one-bedroom apartment here are between €850 and €1,350 per month.
We pay €1,500 per month, which is about average for an apartment of this size, and has 4 rooms in total. I pay €600 a month. Now that includes everything, that's heating, electricity, internet, phone and water. I think my rent is reasonable and it allows me to save. That's very different from the stories I'm hearing from my friends in Dublin especially.
In Ireland, you'll usually pay 1 month's rent as a deposit. And when it comes to getting it back, your landlord can deduct unpaid rent or bills and the cost of things you've broken.
Here in Denmark, you typically pay 3 months deposit to your landlord and a month's rent up front.
And when you move out, you usually get the deposit back pretty quickly because the landlord is required to do so within that time frame, so you have the money to move into your next apartment.
The legal security deposits are 1 month's rent for an unfurnished apartment and can't be more than 2 months for a furnished property. The security deposit must be returned to the tenant either completely or with deductions within a legal time frame of 2 months.
Germany, deposits are worth about 3 months of rent, and the landlord has to put that sum into a special savings account. Often that's actually in the name of the tenant, and any interest that's accrued on that sum belongs to the tenant.
Your landlord can increase your rent after 1 year, and then only once a year after that. You have to get 28 days' notice, and the law says the increase can't exceed the market rate. That's what others are paying for similar properties in your area.
There's a maximum limit on how much each landlord can increase the price by from 1 year to the next, and this is usually specified in your contract when you're moving. This is very nice for us, especially here renting in the long term, because we know over the next 3, 4, 5 years how much we're going to pay in rent, and that makes it very comfortable to stay in a rented accommodation for the long term.
There's a legal maximum by which the rent can be raised, and such a raise can only happen once a year. The new rent is calculated using a local rent index, and this regulation means that rents tend to be quite stable.
Germany also recently introduced rental caps in some areas, that's particularly in the bigger cities, and that makes it illegal for a landlord to charge you more than 10% above the average rental cost.
Within 6 months of moving in, your landlord can terminate at any time by giving 28 days notice. Between 6 months and 4 years, your landlord can only terminate in limited circumstances. If he wants to refurbish the property, sell up, or have a family member move in, if you haven't kept to the rules of the tenancy, or if he feels it's no longer suitable for you.
There are so many protections as a renter in Paris. For example, during the winter, from November to March, it's illegal to evict anyone, even if there is non-payment of rent.
In Denmark, you feel quite secure as a tenant here because the landlord cannot end the contract unless it's for some very justified reasons.
I think most people know that if they move into a place today, the chances of them still being there in 10 to 15 years' time are really high. It's very difficult for a landlord to raise the rent, and it's even more difficult for them to get rid of you.
Here in Ireland, a recent survey said a third of tenants don't know their rights and may also be unaware of the protections they have. The Private Residential Tenancies Board is a state agency which helps resolve rental disputes for a fee of just €25.
In the event that you cannot reach a resolution with your landlord, you can apply for a mediation or an adjudication. If you want to go for mediation, we'll provide you, if you wish, with telephone mediation. You can take that call after work at your convenience, and the mediator will mediate for you between you and your landlord. In the instance, though, that you want a more formal hearing, you come in here for an adjudication.
And if you're a tenant who's moved on from your old house or apartment, but you feel like your landlord treated you unfairly, why should you take a complaint to the PRTB?
Well, there are certain time limits in law for taking your case. You'd be better to take it sooner rather than later. For example, if you were illegally evicted, you could be entitled to considerable compensation. If your deposit was retained and it was found in the course of the hearing that there was no justifiable cause for an illegal eviction, the law allows for compensation of up to €20,000. It's a very serious offence.
The biggest problem now is that there simply aren't enough properties out there to meet demand, and that's unlikely to change anytime soon. So what needs to happen now to help Generation Rent?
So how best to address these issues? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now by two experts in the area, Nat O'Connor and Annette Hughes. Thank you both very much indeed for coming in to us.
Thank you.
Nat, to go to you first of all, I mean, is the idea of a rent control, a rent cap, is that essential at this point?
Well, I think we certainly need to consider it even as a short-term measure for 4 or 5 years. What we've got here is an affordability crisis. Many people simply can't afford rent. In Dublin, other urban areas, particularly single people, are just priced out of the market. Incomes are not rising, or wages are not rising, anything like the extent of rents. So we need to grapple with this problem. Many of the people here are on low incomes who would be in high-quality public housing in another country, but in Ireland we rely on the private rented sector to supply affordable housing, and that's the issue.
Annette, I mean, I know you've worked on a report on this recently, but what about that idea of a short-term rent cap?
The one difficulty, the overarching difficulty really with rent controls is the impact they have on supply and the many adverse consequences they can have for tenants. For example, in jurisdictions like Germany and Sweden, where they're exempt new build, you find that developers actually don't come into the market to provide new units because they're concerned the regulation will extend to new units. In the Irish case as well, there is a real risk that you could generate a massive exodus from the private rented sector by landlords. Our survey showed that 30% of landlords wish to sell their property as soon as prices recovered. So that's a serious issue. You bring in rent controls, the likelihood is that you would have an exodus of landlords from the sector.
So you'll scare the landlords away. I mean, Nat, how do you cope with that issue?
If landlords are scared out, people who want to buy, who are currently renting, of course, will have an opportunity to buy those properties that are coming out of the rental market, which frees up...
If they can afford them.
If they can afford them, which frees up the rental sector. That's one approach. But the other approach, which is taken by Germany, Netherlands and other countries, is a greater supply of public housing.
But I suppose that is going to take years to come on stream. I mean, I think everybody agrees that we need a greater supply of public housing, but in the interim, in this period here, what do you do if a rent control is going to scare away landlords? How do you handle that?
Well, it is possible to build a win-win solution where we have to look at the reasons why landlords are putting up rent. It may be because the banks are putting them under pressure for the mortgages they hold. Well, if we can do something that brings in a rent control for a period of 4 or 5 years, but also freezes those mortgage payments at the same level as the rent for the same period of time, that could be attractive to landlords. It could even attract people into the sector for that period in order to just secure their
So it solves
mortgage.
the crisis we're dealing with now. I mean, if rent controls are not part of the solution, in your belief, what is? How do you solve this crisis?
Well, there's a range of measures that can be done, but in respect of the rent affordability issue, we think the landlord should be required to give 3 months' notice of a rent increase. The tenant should be allowed to accept or reject that 1 month in advance of the rent increase. We think there should be 3 comparable properties provided to justify a rent increase or something of that nature.
So landlords can't just
hike
their
the
rents.
rent, and of course there should be due recognition given to the rent index from the PRTB. But particularly, if I might suggest also there, we proposed a rent certainty lease, which I think really would work in this scenario, which is where landlords and tenants agree voluntarily to enter into a lease which extends beyond 4 or 5 years at a rent at which they would agree between themselves.
So Nat, I mean, there's a range of other proposals, other proposed solutions, if you like, to the crisis. Do you think that they can work without introducing rent controls?
I think there's a number of very important suggestions in the report about strengthening tenants' rights, giving protection. But ultimately, if people are on low incomes and they can't afford to pay their rent, then it doesn't matter how strongly their tenancy is protected, because they still can't afford the house and they'll be forced to move, and that can be very disruptive for individuals. But of course it's very damaging to the wider economy. If people are spending more than they can afford on housing, it means they have less to spend in the local economy, and that's not good either.
Okay. Listen, we're going to leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed, Annette and Nat.
Thank you.
Thank you.